Welcome back to another episode in my everyday cosplay series, where I take costume pieces from my favorite movies and shows and turn them into accessories you can wear any day of the week without everyone knowing how big of a nerd you are. This week I'm taking inspiration from the show Vikings, and I chose the character Floki. I really like this cuff that he wears in the first couple of seasons. Floki's probably my favorite character in the whole show. He's an absolute mad lad, but I adore him. The actor made such interesting choices, and he's just really entertaining. The cuff has a wrapped leather edge and also some stitching along the middle. I decided to make my cuff quite a bit narrower. I just wanted to tone it down a bit for everyday wear. I, of course, have the pattern available in multiple sizes, so you can follow along. Link for that is down below. I think the idea behind the cuff is that two pieces of leather have been stitched together along the middle, but I just used a single piece of leather and carved it to make it look like it was stitched together. So first up, I'm just cutting two strips for the bound edge. I just used a veg tan cowhide. This is about a 2 ounce. These strips are 1 centimeter wide, and I'm just cutting them with a strap cutter. Because this leather is so thin, this is actually really tricky to cut with a strap cutter. That's why I'm just going really slow and taking my time with it. You don't necessarily need to use veg tan for this project. There isn't really any tooling besides the one swivel knife cut, so you could use any leather that you like. For the bound edge, though, I do recommend that you select leather that isn't too thick, otherwise it's just going to get really bulky. For my cuff, I ended up using about 40 centimeters for each strap on either side for the bound edge. You may need quite a bit more. If you're using a thicker leather, it's going to eat up that length a lot faster. Also, if your cuff is a larger size. So I recommend just cutting yourself some extra length and then trimming it down just to make sure that you don't run out. Now I'm cutting out the main body of the cuff. I think this was maybe like a 5 or 6 ounce cowhide, again, just for my scrap bin. I wasn't too worried about this being nice and clean. I actually beat the heck out of it. So I'm using some really rough pieces of leather. Just tracing around the outside of the cuff to begin with. And then I'm just going to cut that out using a metal ruler for the straight edge and a sharp X-Acto knife. I do recommend selecting a cuff size that is a 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch larger than your actual wrist measurement, because the thickness of the leather is going to change the way that it fits. The thicker the leather that you use, the bigger you will need it to be. Just lining up this metal ruler along my pencil line and then just cutting it out. All right, so here's my cuff. So now I'm just dampening the leather so that I can transfer the rest of the pattern. Just applying water with a sponge until it starts to soak in more slowly, and then I know that the leather is getting close to the correct amount of dampness. Now I'm going to lay my pattern on top and trace over all of these lines to transfer the pattern. You can cover the back of your pattern with packing tape just to make it so it doesn't get wet. I didn't bother to do that this time because the pattern isn't all that big. Just tracing over those circles for the eyelets. You want to make sure that you're holding your pattern nice and steady so that it doesn't shift around while you're tracing it. Now I'm tracing over that middle stitch line and marking the location of the stitch holes. Again, I'm not being too precise with this. We want it to look kind of messy and handmade. Now I'm just going to use a swivel knife to carve out that center line. This is just to create the illusion that this is actually two separate pieces of leather that have been stitched together. I want this to look really messy, so I'm just going to weather it a little bit while it's still damp. I'm banging and smacking it with a bunch of random tools that I happen to have within arm's reach. I like to use a bunch of different tools just so that you don't end up with too many uniform shapes. Hit it from multiple different angles, do some scrapes, slashes, and then I'm just grabbing it and scrunching it up to create some wrinkles and ripples in the leather as well. We're trying to create the illusion that this has been worn for years while building boats and fighting in battles. So it's seen some wear and tear. Now I'm going to start punching the many holes in this. In most situations, I would do my dyeing and finishing first before punching holes and adding hardware. But in this case, I want to dye and antique the entire thing all as one. I'm doing all of my punching and stitching and adding my hardware before I do my dyeing. I recommend that you decide what you're going to use as your stitches along the middle before you punch these holes. You want to punch the smallest holes possible to fit whatever you're going to use to lace this up. I'm using a leather lace. I will link that down below. All of my scrunching kind of concealed my stitch markings, so I'm just remarking them so I can see where they are. I'm using the smallest hole punch that I have on these. I personally prefer the kind of hole punch that you hit with a mallet. I also have one of the ones that's a hand grip one, which I do sometimes use, but the mallet one is just my personal preference. It's what I used when I started out and I'm the most comfortable with it. Just make sure if you're using the mallet one that you are punching against some kind of a soft surface. I have a little punching mat here that you can see. I'll link that down below. If you don't have a punching mat, you can also just punch your holes with another piece of scrap leather behind. This is just to protect your tools. If I'm hammering this punch into my slate, I am going to damage it immediately. So now I'm punching the holes for the slits along the side. There are such a thing as slot cutter punches. I used to have one, but I damaged it right away. It was really cheap. I don't cut that many slots, so now I usually just punch a hole at either end and then cut between the holes using a knife. So now I'm using my X-Acto knife to cut between the two holes. I like to cut away from the hole and then turn the whole thing 180 degrees to cut away from the other hole. Again, I'm not being overly precise with this. We don't want this to look like it was made by a machine. We want it to look like it was made by hand by a Viking. All right, so now all of my holes are cut out. I'm going to start doing my lacing. I decided to just dampen the leather before I did all of the lacing. This is just to kind of help mold those straps into shape. Leather is a little bit more flexible when it's wet, and then when it dries, it will hold that shape, leaving myself a little bit of an extra tab at the end so that we have room to secure it. And I'm just wrapping this leather around, making sure that it's straight so that the nice side of the leather is facing out at all times, and pulling it nice and snug each time. So when I reached the end, I just trimmed the excess off, and I decided the best way to secure this was going to be to include it in the eyelet. So I took the end and I positioned it so that it was going to be crossing right over the eyelet hole. I'm punching a hole through it. Like you would with rivets, you want to make sure that you have eyelets that are the correct length for the leather that you're going to be using. Just trimming the excess off. I'm using an eyelet setter here. I hammer it from the back a couple times and then from the front. It's been a hot minute since I secured any eyelets, so my technique is not the best, and the first couple eyelets came out kind of crappy looking. But you know what? I'm just making this cut for myself, so don't judge me. One of the advantages of this leather being damp is that it's quite easy to just pull it into the place that I need it to be. Now I'm going to add that lace up the middle. I'm using a round leather lace. I tucked the end of the lace underneath my bound edge and hammered it to secure it. You could also add a little dab of glue in there. It was pretty tight, so I think mine's okay. I'm just going to leave it as is. Now I'm feeding this lace all the way through. Every once in a while, I'm just stretching the hole out a little bit just to give myself the space to feed the cord through. And also every once in a while, trimming the tip off of the cord because it starts to soften up and gets really hard to feed. When I reached the end, I did the same thing again, and I fed my leather lace underneath the edge binding and hammered it down to secure it. Then I added the last few eyelets. So now the cuff is done. I just redampened the leather and used a mallet just to hammer along the edge. This is just to really flatten out that edge binding and make it all kind of smudge into shape. Here's what our cuff looks like so far. If you're using oil or alcohol-based dye, you want to let it dry entirely before you move on. So I left mine overnight. Once my leather was dry, I moisturized it using some Neat's Foot oil here. Leather is skin, of course, so every time you get it wet, you are actually drying it out a little bit. And over time, that can end up leading to cracking. So after doing anything where I've wet my leather, I like to just moisturize it again. I'm just applying Neat's Foot oil with a wool dauber, trying to get it as even as I can, and then leaving it to soak into the fibers for a while. Now I'm going to dye my cuff. This is actually my own mixture. This was a mixture of Fiebing's dark brown and buckskin that I mixed together to make sort of a lighter brown. Using a wool dauber, making sure I dye that edge, any parts that are going to be visible from the front, and dyeing the whole cuff. Again, we're not being too precise. Remember, this was made by a Viking. Because the wool dauber couldn't get into those indents, I grabbed a paintbrush and used that to make sure that I hit all of the low points that I couldn't quite reach. Once I was happy with the color, I left my dye to dry completely. Once it was completely dry, I sealed the leather dye with my preferred finish, which is acrylic Resolene that has been watered down a little bit. I like to apply my Resolene with a paintbrush so I don't get fibers in it, and I go over and over it just to smooth it out and make sure that no bubbles dry into it. Once the Resolene was completely dry, I came back in with Fiebing's Antique Paste finish. Look at me actually wearing gloves. I'm just smudging that paste down into all of the little indents and holes. You can wipe off any excess and put it back into the container to be reused. I use a flattened piece of paper towel to wipe the excess off of the surface, leaving the antique paste down in all of those holes and crevices, which will then highlight, or I guess low light them so they show up better. Once I've buffed off most of the antique paste, I'm going to leave this to sit for quite a while so it dries entirely. Once it's completely dry, I will do a final buff just to get the last little bit off of the surface. Once the antique is dry, I used a final coat of finish just to seal all of it in. Most of the time for lace-up cuffs, I prefer to use a round black elastic just because it makes it really easy to put on and off. But just for the aesthetic, I'm using a small little strip of leather to tie up this cuff. And here's the finished cuff. Now you're ready to build ships and conquer your enemies. And make sure to follow for more leather projects and other nerdy shenanigans.